The United States government has shut down. It is the first time in more than 6 years that such a shutdown of the US government has happened. Essential services like the postal service, banking, healthcare, airports, national security, they will continue, but there will be delays, disruptions, and uncertainty all across non-essential services coast to coast. This shutdown is expected to impact millions of Americans. Despite the hectic parleys and the negotiations that went down in the US Congress, Democrats and Republicans could not reach a consensus to fund the government. And this has been a peculiar feature in the Trump administration. The last major shutdown that we saw was in 2018-19, when the federal government was shut down for 35 days in the Trump first term. So the big question is, what happens next? And why is this shutdown expected to be much longer than all previous shutdowns? I dig a little deeper. The US federal government shut down Wednesday at midnight amid a bitter spending deadlock between President Donald Trump and Democrats in the US Congress. This is the third major shutdown of the US government in recent years, and this time it is expected to deeply disrupt federal services. It will also leave many federal workers furloughed, which is that they are placed on temporary unpaid leave. This was the first federal shutdown of the US government since 2019. Back then, parts of the US government were shut down for 35 days in a standoff between the Democrats and President Trump over the president's demand to fund a wall at the southern border with Mexico. This time, the dispute is over Democrats and their demand that the president agree to extend healthcare subsidies, which would expire by the end of the year, and also restore cuts that have been made to Medicaid enacted over the summer as part of Trump's marquee Big Beautiful Bill. The shutdown became all but inevitable on Tuesday night after the Senate Democrats voted just hours before the midnight deadline. They blocked the Republican plan to keep federal fund flowing. It was a 55-45 vote. The GOP plan would have extended funding through to November, but it fell short of the 60 votes, the two-thirds majority that's required for passage of this bill. Republicans also blocked a Democratic plan which would have extended the funding through to the end of October and add $1 more trillion to healthcare spending. Hence, there was no option but a government shutdown.
Republicans are plunging America into a shutdown, rejecting bipartisan talks, pushing a partisan bill, and risking America's healthcare, worst of all. A few moments ago, Republicans once again rejected Democrats' proposals to avoid a shutdown, fix healthcare premiums, and spare Americans the calamity of skyrocketing through the roof healthcare costs. Republicans blocked it again.
But instead of any negotiation between the Democrats and the Republicans, lawmakers on both parties spent hours before the deadline pointing fingers at each other for the shutdown crisis. Trump issued threats from the White House. He appeared to relish the prospect of a shutdown, which he said he would use to hurt the Democrats. He said he would move during the shutdown to enact measures that would be, quote, bad for the Democrats.
Well, the Democrats want to shut it down, and so when you shut it down, you have to do layoffs. So we'd be laying off a lot of people that are going to be very affected, and the Democrats, they're going to be Democrats. As you know, this country, no country can afford to pay for illegal immigration, health care for everybody that comes into the country, and that's what they're insisting. And obviously I have an obligation to not accept that. That would affect everybody.
Back in March, a clutch of Senate Democrats, led by Chuck Schumer, allowed a stopgap spending bill to pass through, and that prompted an outpouring of anger from liberal voters. This time, the Democrats have picked up a fight with Trump on health care. They believe this is an issue which repeatedly various polls have shown that the Democrats have an upper hand on, unlike immigration or law and order and other issues that the Republican base cares about. If the Obamacare tax credits are allowed to lapse by the end of the year, about 4 million people are projected to lose insurance coverage. And the prices of drugs will go up an additional 20% for 20 million people more. Trump and other Republicans continued to hammer at the accusation that Democrats were shutting down the government in order to give healthcare benefits to unauthorized immigrants. Trump even posted a meme making fun of House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries wearing a Mexican hat to Mexican music. The US government runs on an annual budget that must be passed by the Congress and it must be signed off by the President. If the Congress fails to pass about a dozen appropriations bills, a stopgap measure called a continuing resolution is then passed. If neither of this happens by the start of the financial year, which is the 1st of October every year, and if the President refuses to sign that, then the federal government runs out of the authority to spend any money. That leads to a shutdown where non-essential federal operations are put on pause until funding is restored. Essential services like national security, active military operations, airport security, border patrol, and federal prisons will continue to function despite the shutdown, but many other non-essential services get disrupted. National parks, museums, monuments are closed, federal workers are sent home without pay, and passport and visa processing slows down. The last major shutdown was in 2019 under President Donald Trump in his first term. That shutdown lasted 35 days, which is the longest in American history. The dispute was over Trump's demand for $5 billion in funding for a US-Mexico border wall. The Democrats had opposed it. This time, the shutdown could go on for longer, and that is because the position between the two main parties has become even more extreme. The Democrats have swung far too much to the left, to the progressive wing of the party led by the likes of New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC. And the same dynamic is at play in the grand old party, the Republican Party, which has lurched further to the right under Trump, and it no longer sees a room for compromise. In the end, it is the American voter and the American tax-paying public that is left in the lurch. All right, I want to go straight across to Julia Brenbrook, who's the CNN correspondent live for us from the White House tonight. Thank you very much, Julia, for speaking with us. This is not the first time that the U.S. federal government is shut down. Many believe, though, that the stakes are much higher this time around. Why is that, and how do you see this sort of playing itself out over the next few days and weeks compared to the last time the shutdown happened, which was in 2019 again, when Trump was president?
We are on day one of this government shutdown, and there is really no telling how long this could last, especially as lawmakers, Republicans and Democrats are really playing the blame game right now. There doesn't seem to be a lot of room to compromise. As you mentioned, the last time that we experienced this was back in President Donald Trump's first term. It was near the end of 2018 and going into the beginning of 2019. Now, we saw the leaders, and that one, I guess I should say, that was the longest that we had seen in more than 4 decades. It lasted for 35 days and just had a huge impact on things here. So as we see how long this could last, we saw the top leaders, both Democrats and Republicans, top congressional leaders, visit the White House earlier this week in hopes. The stated goal was to try and come to an agreement to avoid this type of a shutdown. But obviously last night in the Senate, they did not pass a short-term stopgap funding measure, and so we did see that clock run out. Speaking of the blame game that I mentioned earlier, the White House, even their official website, had a countdown, and it reads, Democrats have shut the government down, when that went to 0. So we're hearing that from both sides, people really digging their heels in there. But as far as how this could differ and why the stakes could be a little bit higher, the White House has threatened that we could see layoffs. We are typically seeing some federal employees furloughed until the end of a shutdown, but layoffs could have more of a lasting impact if they do go through with those steps.
So how do these shutdowns, and particularly this one, how does it affect the life of the average American? Essential services, whether it's military services, national security services, Medicare, Medicaid, etc., will continue, but non-essential services will take a big beating. So how does it affect the life of the average American? And what's really the way forward? Because the Democrats have impinged this on health care. It's an issue they believe they have the upper hand on. So what will break this deadlock?
Yeah, Democrats, their argument here is that there have to be some protections for some of those health care provisions. Republicans say this is not the time to deal with that. And so there really is a standstill here. Back in March, when we saw them pass a short-term funding bill, we saw Schumer go ahead and support that idea. But now he says we can't do this again. We've got to get these protections in, and this is the time to do it. Keeping in mind, Republicans have control of the White House, the Senate, and the House. So this is one of the only times for Democrats to really push to get something in, because they do need Democratic votes in the Senate in order to fund the government. And every shutdown is different here. As you mentioned, those essential services, things that are deemed necessary to protect lives and property, those will likely keep going, although every shutdown is different. But we will see and have seen some of those federal agencies come out with contingency plans for how the work will continue, what type of work will continue, and how many people will remain employed during those times.
All right, Julia Benbrook, live for us tonight from the White House. Thank you very much for joining us on Brass-Tacks. Thank you.